"I'm claiming half your fortune, including your grandmother's inheritance," Robert declared with a self-satisfied smirk, his voice reverberating through the courtroom as though he were announcing winning lottery numbers. The arrogance in his tone made my stomach churn, but I maintained my composure in my seat at the defendant's table. "My name is Margaret Anderson. I'm 47 years old, and I never envisioned I'd be seated in a divorce courtroom in Memphis, Tennessee, observing my husband of 6 years attempting to seize everything I'd labored for throughout my entire life." Robert sat on the opposite side of the room with his legal counsel, appearing as though he'd already secured the jackpot. His costly suit, one I'd financed naturally, was impeccably pressed, and his dark hair was groomed in that manner that once captivated me but now revolted me. "Your Honor," Robert's attorney proceeded, "my client is entitled to half of all matrimonial assets, including the considerable inheritance Mrs. Anderson obtained during their marriage." The lawyer's briefcase bulged with documents, all detailing how Robert intended to depart with my grandmother's carefully preserved wealth. I observed the courtroom observers leaning forward in their seats, plainly intrigued by what they presumed would be a substantial financial settlement. Some were likely calculating the figures mentally, speculating how much Robert would walk away with. Several journalists had even appeared, attracted by rumors of a multi-million-dollar divorce case involving a prominent Memphis businesswoman. Judge Morrison, a formidable woman in her 60s with silver-streaked hair, examined the initial documentation with an expressionless face. She'd been overseeing family court for over 2 decades, and I suspected she'd witnessed every deceptive tactic imaginable. But something indicated to me she hadn't yet seen what I was preparing to disclose. Robert rotated slightly in his chair to display what he presumably considered a triumphant smile. The boldness of it made my blood simmer. This was the identical man who once brought me tea in the mornings, who professed he loved me for who I was, not what I possessed. 6 years of marriage, and it had all been a deception. The courtroom felt stifling with its dark walnut paneling and the burden of legal proceedings suspended in the atmosphere. Outside, I could detect the muffled sounds of Memphis traffic, people conducting their ordinary lives while mine was being examined before strangers. I gripped my handbag tighter, sensing the envelope inside that would alter everything. "Mrs. Anderson," Judge Morrison addressed me directly. "Do you have any response to these allegations?" I rose gradually, my heart racing, but my determination stronger than ever. This was the moment I'd been anticipating, the moment when Robert's avarice would finally overtake him. "Your Honor, I believe there's something the court must examine." Reflecting back, I should have recognized the warning indicators much earlier in our relationship. Robert had swept me off my feet during an especially vulnerable period in my life. I just turned 42 and was operating my consulting firm, Summit Strategy Partners, with reasonable success but minimal time for romance. My grandmother had been my closest confidant until her passing 4 years before I encountered Robert, and I was still mourning her absence when he materialized at a business conference in Little Rock. He was captivating, considerate, and appeared genuinely fascinated by my work assisting small enterprises optimize their operations. "You're extraordinary," he'd say, observing me analyze financial statements. "I've never encountered anyone who comprehends data the way you do." At the time, I believed he was impressed by my intellect. Now I understood he was calculating my financial value. Our courtship was a whirlwind of lavish dinners and romantic escapes. Robert worked as a district manager for a medical equipment company, but he always seemed to possess funds for extravagant dates. "I believe in investing in the people I value," he'd say when I questioned his expenditures. I was flattered by his attention and generosity, not realizing he was already strategizing his long-term investment approach. When Robert proposed after 9 months, I was reluctant. My grandmother had always cautioned me about men who advanced too rapidly, but Robert was insistent. "Life's too brief to delay," he insisted. "I understand what I desire and I desire you." His proposal was elaborate, A private dinner on a yacht with a string quartet performing our preferred songs. The ring was magnificent, probably worth more than his yearly salary, though I didn't contemplate that at the time. My attorney, Linda Whitmore, had insisted on a prenuptial agreement. Any successful businesswoman requires protection, she'd explained. It's not romantic, but it's pragmatic. I'd felt uncomfortable raising it with Robert, worried he'd think I didn't trust him or that I was more concerned with money than affection. But Robert's reaction surprised me. He laughed and dismissed it like it was insignificant. Naturally, darling. Whatever brings you comfort. I'm not marrying you for your wealth. I'm marrying you for you. He signed the documents without even perusing them, joking that love doesn't need fine print. His casual demeanor convinced me that my concerns were baseless. It's just a romantic formality, he'd said, scrawling his signature with a flourish, like promising to love, honor, and cherish, but with more legal terminology. I remembered feeling relieved that he was so understanding, so willing to ease my worries. Linda had been meticulous in drafting the agreement, protecting not just my existing assets but any future inheritance or business expansion. Your grandmother's estate will eventually come to you, she'd reminded me. This ensures it remains in your family where it belongs. At the time, I thought she was being excessively cautious. Now, I realized she'd been absolutely prescient. The genuine shock arrived 21 months into our marriage when I received the notification about my grandmother's estate. She'd left me everything: her home, her investments, her collection of antique jewelry, and $3.2 million in meticulously managed funds. It was far more than I'd ever anticipated, and the inheritance transformed my financial situation instantly. Robert's reaction to the news had been revealing, though I'd missed the significance at the time. His eyes had literally illuminated when I informed him about the money. $3.2 million. He'd repeated as if he couldn't quite comprehend it. Margaret, we're wealthy. The way he said "we" should have been my first indication. From that moment forward, Robert's spending habits changed dramatically. He resigned from his position within 7 months, claiming he wanted to pursue new opportunities and be available to support my success. What he actually did was spend my money as though it were his personal allowance. He purchased a luxury vehicle, supposedly for networking purposes. He invested in a colleague's wine bar without consulting me, losing $35,000 when the enterprise failed within 18 months. He reserved expensive vacations, joined an elite tennis club, and started dressing as though he'd always been affluent. Every time I questioned a purchase, he'd remind me that we're partners and that couples should trust each other with financial decisions. The breaking point arrived 7 months ago when I discovered Robert had been telling people at the tennis club that the inheritance was family money that belonged to both of us. He'd started introducing himself as a venture capitalist and consultant, conveniently neglecting to mention that all his investments were made with my grandmother's carefully preserved wealth. When I confronted him about his lies and his spending, Robert became defensive and then vicious. You act like it's some big secret that I married up, he'd snapped. Everyone knows you needed someone like me to enjoy life. Before we met, you were just a lonely workaholic with no social life. His words cut deep because there was a grain of truth in them. I had been lonely, and Robert had brought excitement and companionship into my life. But I realized he'd been executing a long game, positioning himself as my savior while systematically planning to claim everything I'd inherited. The final straw came when I found emails between Robert and his attorney discussing divorce strategy. They'd been planning this for months, timing it to maximize his potential settlement. Robert had even researched Tennessee's divorce laws, looking for ways to claim that his emotional support and lifestyle contributions entitled him to a larger share of my assets. That's when I'd finally contacted Linda again and filed for divorce myself. I refused to let Robert control the narrative or the timeline. If he wanted to fight over my grandmother's money, I'd give him one, but it wouldn't unfold the way he expected. Now standing in this courtroom, I was prepared to show Robert and everyone else exactly what his greed had earned him. I reached into my handbag and withdrew the manila envelope that Linda had prepared for this precise moment. The courtroom was completely silent, except for the soft rustle of paper and the distant hum of the ventilation system. Robert's confident expression faltered slightly as he watched me approach the judge's bench. "Your Honor," I said, my voice steady and clear. "I believe the court needs to review this document before proceeding with any asset division discussions." Judge Morrison extended her hand and accepted the envelope. "What is the nature of this document, Mrs. Anderson?" "It's a prenuptial agreement, Your Honor. One that my husband signed before our marriage 6 years ago." The change in the courtroom atmosphere was immediate and electric. Robert's attorney, a slim man named Frank Pearson, shot up from his chair as though he'd been stung. "Your Honor, we were not made aware of any prenuptial agreement. This is highly irregular." "Sit down, Mr. Pearson," Judge Morrison commanded, already breaking the seal on the envelope. "I'll examine the documents and determine their validity." I returned to my seat, keeping my eyes focused on Robert. His face had gone from confident to confused to something approaching panic in the span of 30 seconds. He was whispering frantically to his attorney, gesturing toward the judge's bench. I could make out fragments of his urgent words. "She never mentioned, and how is this possible?" Linda Whitmore, my attorney, remained perfectly calm beside me. She'd been preparing for this moment for months, ensuring every detail of our strategy was flawless. "Just watch," she whispered to me with a small smile. Judge Morrison was a thorough reader, taking her time with each page of the agreement. The document was comprehensive. Linda had made sure of that 6 years ago. It outlined exactly which assets were protected, which debts would remain separate, and most importantly, how any future inheritance would be handled. "This appears to be a properly executed prenuptial agreement," Judge Morrison announced after several minutes of careful review. "It's dated 7 weeks before your marriage, witnessed by 2 notaries, and signed by both parties." Robert's attorney looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. I realized that Frank Pearson had filed this divorce case without doing basic due diligence. He'd assumed, just like Robert, that the marriage was a straightforward asset grab. "Your Honor," Robert suddenly stood up, his voice cracking slightly. "I need to see that document. I don't remember signing anything like that." The judge's eyebrows rose at Robert's outburst. "Mr. Anderson, please remain seated and allow your attorney to handle these proceedings." But Robert was spiraling now, his carefully constructed confidence crumbling. "Margaret, what is this? You never told me this was some kind of legal trap." "Mr. Anderson," Judge Morrison's voice cut through the courtroom like a whip. "You will remain silent or I will hold you in contempt. Your attorney may request to review the document through proper channels." Frank Pearson approached the bench with obvious reluctance. I watched him examine the prenuptial agreement, his face growing paler with each page. He returned to his table and began whispering urgently to Robert, who was shaking his head in disbelief. The courtroom spectators were now fully engaged, sensing that something dramatic was unfolding. I could hear muffled conversations and the scratching of reporters' pens as they tried to capture every detail of Robert's public humiliation. "Your Honor," Frank finally addressed the court, his voice notably lacking its earlier confidence. "My client would like to request a brief recess to review these documents more thoroughly." Judge Morrison checked her watch. "Mr. Pearson, did you not conduct discovery regarding potential prenuptial agreements before filing your asset claims?" The attorney's silence was answer enough. Robert had been so confident in his strategy that he'd never even mentioned the possibility of a prenup to his lawyer. Frank Pearson had been blindsided just as much as his client. "I'll give you 10 minutes to review the document," Judge Morrison declared. But I should warn you that this appears to be a legally binding agreement that significantly impacts your client's claims. During the recess, I watched Robert and his attorney huddled in intense conversation near the courtroom windows. Robert's gestures were becoming more animated and desperate as Frank explained the implications of the prenuptial agreement. Even from across the room, I could see the exact moment when Robert realized his plan had completely backfired. Linda used the time to review her own notes and prepare for what she knew would be Robert's last-ditch attempts to challenge the agreement. "He's going to claim fraud or duress," she predicted quietly. "Men like Robert always blame everyone else when their schemes fall apart." She was right. When court resumed, Frank Pearson immediately launched into a desperate legal argument. "Your Honor, my client believes he was deceived about the nature of this document. Mrs. Anderson presented it as a romantic formality, not a comprehensive asset protection agreement." Judge Morrison looked distinctly unimpressed. "Mr. Pearson, are you claiming your client signed a legal document without reading it?" "Your Honor, my client trusted his wife to be. He believed she was being honest about the document's scope and implications." I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing. Robert had always prided himself on being a shrewd businessman, someone who could read people and situations. Now his attorney was arguing that he was too trusting and naive to understand a legal contract. "The document is clearly labeled as a prenuptial agreement," Judge Morrison observed, flipping through the pages. "It includes standard warnings about seeking independent legal counsel. Did your client choose to waive that right?" Frank shuffled through his papers nervously. "Yes, Your Honor. My client waived his right to independent counsel. And the document was reviewed by a notary public, correct? With your client present and confirming his identity?" "Yes, Your Honor." Judge Morrison turned her attention directly to Robert. "Mr. Anderson, when you signed this document, did anyone force you to do so? Were you under any kind of duress or coercion?" Robert's face was red with embarrassment and anger. "No, Your Honor, but I thought it was just paperwork." Margaret made it sound like it didn't matter. "Did you read the document before signing it?" The question hung in the air like a sword. Robert looked around the courtroom as if searching for an escape route. The silence stretched on until it became uncomfortable for everyone present. "Mr. Anderson, I asked you a direct question." I skimmed it," Robert finally admitted. "But Margaret said it was just a formality." Judge Morrison's expression was a masterpiece of judicial disapproval. "Mr. Anderson, you signed a legal document without reading it, after waiving your right to legal counsel. And now you're asking this court to invalidate it because you didn't take it seriously." The courtroom was completely silent. Even the reporters had stopped writing, mesmerized by Robert's public humiliation. I felt a surge of satisfaction watching him squirm under the judge's scrutiny. "Your Honor," Frank made one final attempt. "Perhaps we could argue that the agreement is unconscionable given the disparity in—" "Mr. Pearson," Judge Morrison interrupted. "Have you reviewed the financial disclosures included with this prenuptial agreement?" Frank flipped through the document again, clearly searching for something he'd missed. "There are extensive financial disclosures here, Your Honor." "Indeed there are." Mrs. Anderson provided complete documentation of her assets, income, and expected inheritance. Your client signed acknowledgments confirming he reviewed and understood all financial information. This is one of the most thorough prenuptial agreements I've seen in my 25 years on the bench. Robert looked like he was about to be sick. The golden boy who had charmed his way through life was finally facing consequences for his actions. Judge Morrison cleared her throat and began reading directly from the prenuptial agreement, her voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. Section 3, Paragraph A. All assets owned by either party prior to marriage shall remain the separate property of that party. Section 3, Paragraph B. Any inheritance received by either party during the marriage shall be considered separate property and shall not be subject to division upon divorce. Robert's face went through a spectrum of colors, red to white to green. He gripped the edge of his table so hard his knuckles were white. "That can't be legal," he muttered loud enough for several people to hear. Section 5, Judge Morrison continued, addresses spousal support. Quote, "Neither party shall be entitled to alimony or spousal support from the other, regardless of the length of the marriage or the disparity in income." Quote. The judge looked up from the document. This section was initialed by both parties and witnessed separately. Frank Pearson was frantically taking notes, probably trying to find any possible loophole or technicality. But Linda had been too thorough 6 years ago. Every potential challenge had been anticipated and addressed. "Your Honor," I stood up. "If I may address the court." "Proceed, Mrs. Anderson." "When I inherited my grandmother's estate 21 months ago, I consulted with my attorney about whether the inheritance was protected under the prenuptial agreement. We confirmed that it was fully covered under Section 3, Paragraph B. The inheritance has been kept in separate accounts and has never been commingled with marital assets. This was the final nail in Robert's coffin. Not only was the prenup ironclad, but I'd been scrupulously careful about keeping the inheritance separate. There was no way for him to claim any portion of it. Judge Morrison nodded approvingly. "Mrs. Anderson, did you use any portion of your inheritance for marital expenses or joint purchases?" "No, Your Honor. I maintained my regular income for household expenses. The inheritance has remained completely separate." Robert exploded. "That's not true. She bought things for us. She paid for vacations." "Mr. Anderson," Judge Morrison's voice was ice cold. "You are out of order. Sit down immediately." But Robert was beyond reason now. His carefully constructed facade had completely crumbled. "This is insane. I've been with her for 6 years. I supported her emotionally. I gave up my career. You quit your job to spend my money," I said quietly, unable to help myself. "Mrs. Anderson," Judge Morrison warned, but her tone was almost amused. Frank was tugging on Robert's jacket, trying to get him to sit down and stop making things worse, but Robert was in full meltdown mode. His true nature finally showing through. "She trapped me," Robert shouted. "She made me think we were partners. She let me believe that money was ours. Mr. Anderson, if you cannot control yourself, I will have the bailiff remove you from my courtroom." The threat of being physically removed finally penetrated Robert's rage. He sat down heavily, his chest heaving with angry breaths. But the damage was done. Everyone in the courtroom had seen his true character, the greedy, entitled man who had married me for my money and then had the audacity to act like a victim when his plan failed. Judge Morrison reviewed the final pages of the prenuptial agreement with deliberate care. The tension in the room was palpable as everyone waited for her ruling. I felt a calm satisfaction settling over me. After months of Robert's manipulation and lies, the truth was finally coming to light. Based on my review of this prenuptial agreement, Judge Morrison announced, "I am ready to render my decision on asset division." Judge Morrison removed her reading glasses and looked directly at Robert with an expression that could have frozen fire. "Mr. Anderson, this prenuptial agreement is valid, comprehensive, and legally binding. You are entitled to exactly nothing from your wife's premarital assets, inheritance, or business holdings." The words hit Robert like physical blows. His mouth fell open, and he stared at the judge in complete disbelief. "Nothing," he whispered. "Nothing," Judge Morrison confirmed. "Furthermore, according to Section 6 of this agreement, all debts incurred individually by either party remain the responsibility of that party." "Mrs. Anderson, do you have documentation of debts incurred solely by your husband?" Linda handed me a thick folder, which I passed to the bailiff. "Yes, Your Honor. credit card debts, the car loan, the failed wine bar investment, and tennis club fees totaling approximately $94,000. Robert's attorney looked like he wanted to disappear entirely. The case he'd thought would net him a substantial fee had turned into a complete disaster. "Mr. Anderson," Judge Morrison continued, "not only will you receive no assets from this marriage, but you remain personally responsible for $94,000 in debt that you accumulated during the marriage." The courtroom erupted in murmurs and whispers. I could hear someone behind me stifle a laugh. Robert had gone from expecting millions to facing bankruptcy in the span of 30 minutes. "Your Honor," Robert's voice was barely audible. "This can't be right. 6 years of marriage has to count for something." Judge Morrison's smile was razor sharp. "It does count for something, Mr. Anderson. It counts as an expensive lesson in reading legal documents before signing them." The gavel came down with a finality that echoed through the courtroom like thunder. "The court grants the divorce petition filed by Mrs. Anderson. No assets shall be transferred to Mr. Anderson. All individual debts remain with the party who incurred them. This court is adjourned." Robert sat in stunned silence as the reality of his situation sank in. He'd spent 6 years positioning himself for this moment, only to discover that his plan had been doomed from the day he casually signed the prenuptial agreement without reading it. People began filing out of the courtroom, but I remained seated, watching Robert's world collapse around him. Frank Pearson was already packing his briefcase, clearly eager to escape this professional embarrassment. Several reporters approached me for comment, but Linda intercepted them with practiced efficiency. "Margaret," Robert called out as I finally stood to leave. "We need to talk about this. This isn't over." I turned to face him one last time. "Robert, it was over the moment you decided to marry me for my money instead of loving me for who I am. The prenuptial agreement didn't ruin your plan. Your greed did." His face crumpled as the full weight of his situation hit him. No inheritance, no assets, and crushing debt that would follow him for years. The man who had charmed his way through life had finally met a situation that couldn't be smooth-talked or manipulated away. As I walked toward the courtroom doors with Linda beside me, I felt lighter than I had in months. The nightmare was finally over, and Robert's true nature had been exposed for everyone to see. Justice, it turned out, sometimes came with its own sense of poetic irony. Robert's life unraveled completely in the months following our divorce. The $94,000 in debt forced him into bankruptcy within 7 months, destroying his credit and making it impossible for him to maintain his lifestyle. His reputation in Memphis's business community was ruined when word spread about how he tried to steal his wife's inheritance, making him a cautionary tale about prenuptial agreements and the dangers of marrying for money. The tennis club revoked his membership when he couldn't pay his dues, and the luxury car was repossessed, leaving him dependent on public transportation. His dating life became non-existent as women in our social circles learned about his gold-digging scheme, warning each other about the charming man who viewed marriage as a business transaction. He was forced to move in with his elderly parents in Jackson and take an entry-level sales job. His dreams of living off my grandmother's money were replaced by the harsh reality of starting over at 49 with nothing but debt and a damaged reputation. I used a portion of my protected inheritance to establish the Anderson Foundation, which provides legal assistance to women seeking prenuptial agreements and divorce representation, ensuring that other women wouldn't fall victim to financial predators like Robert. Looking back on my journey from trusting wife to empowered divorcee, I realized that my grandmother's wisdom about protecting family wealth had saved me from more than just financial loss. It had saved me from a lifetime of being used by someone who saw my love as nothing more than a pathway to easy money. The envelope I handed Judge Morrison that day contained more than just a legal document. It contained the truth about who Robert really was and what he'd always wanted. And in the end, that truth set me free.